بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وحبيبنا سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Okay, so as usual business, we will inshallah start with the video, and then we will try to go through the different sections of it and try to take the best out of it, inshallah. And we have a special guest with us today, Brother Turaabi. You know, he's a beloved brother of ours, and he has great insights, especially related to religious insights, and of course, like overall. But you know, he can add to us a lot in this aspect. So we are very happy to have him here with us, and we all hope that it will, inshallah, be very beneficial for all of you. So thanks a lot, everyone, for joining, and enjoy listening to the video, inshallah. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
Well, I'll tell you, the American people really need to stop thinking of themselves as Americans. Honestly, this is a mental trap. It's a trick, actually, to make you feel invested in a system that does not invest in you. If you're a part of a so-called minority community, especially, then you only think of yourselves that way because you're an American, or you think of yourself as an American. So you're a minority in American society. But it's a lie if you look at the bigger picture. Obviously, you're not minorities. You're members of the global majority who happen to live in the United States. You're a diaspora community from the global majority. The majority in that country is a global minority. But as long as you think of yourselves as American, well, you will think of yourselves as a minority. Because you've believed in this society, in this system. You have invested in it, and you believe yourself to be a part of the very society that tells you you don't belong in that society. You see? It would be like inmates in a prison thinking that they're actually part of the staff of the prison administration. Like you aren't incarcerated and abused in that jail, you just work there. Except that the other people who call themselves prison staff get to go home after their shifts, while you just get to stay there. You have to stay there in your cell. But you pretend, you imagine, that there's some equality between you and the prison guard, between you and the prison staff. That's what it's like if you're a so-called minority in America. You're a prisoner who thinks that he's a guard. But the guards will never hesitate to remind you which one of you has the baton, which one of you has the club, which one of you has the rights, and which one of you has freedom. But even then, you seem to think that the prison works just like seniority at a company or something, as if as a prisoner, the longer you serve, eventually you'll get to be the warden. That's how delusional you are. It doesn't work like that. No, you're not an American, and you're not a minority. You're a member of the global majority who just happens to be in the United States. And I'm telling you, this applies whether your so-called minority status is based on race or color or ethnicity, or if it's based on religion, or even if it's based on your economic status, because most of the people on earth are not white, they're not Christian, and they're not rich. So you need to think of yourselves as part of the rest of the people in the world who look like you, who believe like you, and who struggle financially like you. Those are your compatriots, your comrades, your brothers and sisters. That's your nation. If you think of yourselves in any other kind of way, then this is just a tactic for reducing you and cutting you off from the power that comes from numbers. Do you know how foolish it sounds to anyone else, anyone who looks at the totality of the world, when you say something like Asian minorities, black and brown minorities, right? It's absurd. Over 85% of the population on the planet is either Asian or African or Latin American. You think that you're a blade of grass in the desert, but the desert is just a little tiny sandbox in the middle of a field of grass. So don't think of yourselves as minorities in America. Think of yourselves as representing the global majority that encircles that country. So if you can readjust your thinking along these lines, then you might also better understand that as a part of the international majority, you're supposed to redress your grievances to international bodies for justice. And you look at the crimes and the violations that are committed against you in that country as breaches of international law, which they are. The same way that there are crimes and violations of international law when that country does the same things overseas, when America does things overseas. Because your rights are profoundly violated in that country. And the worst part about it is that the indoctrination system has normalized it for you and has made you think that your only recourse when your rights are violated is to go to the ones who are committing the violations. You know, they cut you off from the international community, from the global majority, and made you think that when, for example, when the police murder innocent members of your community, you're supposed to turn to the police for justice. You're supposed to go to the very security forces that are targeting your community for extrajudicial killings and ask them for justice. No. You're supposed to go to the United Nations. You're supposed to go to the International Criminal Court, to the International Court of Justice. I mean, tell me, why the so-called police officers and the chiefs of police and the police commissioners and so on, all of those police officials who are involved in any extrajudicial killing in the United States, why were they put on trial in Minnesota, in Pennsylvania, Missouri, Texas, or Kansas, or what have you? Why not at The Hague? I mean, you say it's systemic, don't you? You know it's systemic targeting of so-called minority communities. You can't look at the mass incarceration numbers and not know that this is systemic targeting, mass incarceration of members of the global majority in the United States, who are then forced to work as slave labor for private enterprise in prison, often for the rest of their lives. This is systemic population reduction of so-called minority communities through extrajudicial killing and detention. Well, that's nothing but a form of ethnic cleansing. But again, they make you think it's normal. It's not normal. It's criminal. And it's a crime against humanity. It's a violation of international law. And you are members of the international community, whether you realize it or not. Your government, your system, has got you believing that international law doesn't apply to you. Well, why do you suppose they made you think that? Because they don't want you to know that their treatment of you is not normal, that it's not civilized, and that it's not legal. They have you thinking that you have the most rights of any people on earth, the most freedom of any people on earth, and so on. And that's precisely because you don't. You're like an abused spouse who's been browbeat into thinking that you're married to the most wonderful person on earth. Meanwhile, that same person treats you like a monster, treats everyone else like a monster, and is viewed by everyone else as a monster. The mass incarceration, prison industrial complex, ethnic cleansing system is a violation of the International Labor Organization's Convention number 29, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And of course, it's a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is nothing short of modern-day slavery. And it's a shame that you don't even know that there are laws higher than the laws of your city, your state, and your federal government that exist to protect you. The same goes for every manifestation of racism, of white supremacy, and every form of discrimination in your country. These are all violations of international law, and you should have redress to that. You know, they just made homelessness illegal in America. Can you imagine that? It's illegal to be homeless, but not illegal to make you homeless. Criminalizing being poor when you are made poor by a criminal system. You're not allowed to not have enough money to pay for your own survival, but they're allowed to make your survival too expensive to pay for. And if you have any blotch on your credit record, well, it may as well be a criminal record. You can't rent, you can't get a job, you can't secure housing, you can't get a car, anything. And they talk about China's social credit system. Well, you invented it. They've got your social security number around your neck like an iron collar. Everybody in that country has debt collectors chasing after them like bloodhounds after an escaped convict. Well, you know, there's something called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that's supposed to protect you. But they don't want anyone to know about it. They want you to think that your only recourse is to go to the government for help, when it's that same government that puts you in debt, keeps you in debt, and is itself in debt. The same government that is bought and paid for by the very predatory, parasitic companies that make life too expensive in America, that make it impossible to get an education without drowning in debt for the rest of your life. The same government and the same courts that have taken all the rights and protections away from you and given them to corporations and given them to the super rich. They don't want you to even know about your rights under international law. This is the dual purpose of American exceptionalism. They don't respect international law. They think that they're above the law, and they want you to have that same attitude. But the difference is that you're suffering because of it, because they don't respect international law when it comes to their own people. You think that they defy the law everywhere else but adhere to it at home? No. They're criminals outside and they're criminals inside. And the thing that enables them to be that way is their domination of the United Nations. You have as much at stake as the rest of the world does when it comes to the invocation of Article 6. The only difference between you and America's victims all around the world is that at least they know that they're victims. You think you're privileged. If we can get the U.S. expelled from the UN for their persistent violations of the principles of the UN Charter, I'm telling you, You can't even fathom how different this world could be, how different your own lives can be. The Article 6 campaign is fighting for a day when the United States will be held accountable for its crimes against humanity, both abroad and at home. This measure would be the most decisive blow imaginable to the American tyranny that you and I have been living under and suffering under for our whole lives, and what the whole world has been enduring for as long as anyone can remember. We can foresee a future with the Article 6 campaign in which the United Nations is, once it's liberated from U.S. domination and control, it could actually impose accountability on the United States, something that is practically and procedurally impossible right now, as long as America reigns on the Security Council. We can envision a future where the world unites to impose economic sanctions on America, to cut the empire off at the knees and force it to reckon with the blood they have on their hands. But this struggle isn't only about liberating the oppressed people of the world. No, like I said, it's also about liberating the American people themselves from the chains of corporate tyranny and state oppression. Because the United States is not just a global oppressor, it's an oppressor of its own people. The American people have been deceived, they've been manipulated, and they've been dominated by the private sector, by the corporations that control their government, control their economy, and control their everyday lives. These corporations, these faceless entities of greed, have built their empire on the suffering of the working class, the exploitation of the poor, and on the backs of all of those poor people who believed in the so-called American dream. But it turns out that it wasn't a dream at all. It's a drunken stupor. You're drunk from propaganda and indoctrination, and on top of that, you're punch drunk from enduring the relentless beating that system has been giving you your whole life. And it's time to sober up. Don't you know that if the UN is allowed to do its job, America can be punished for its actions? America can be sanctioned. And what better punishment could there possibly be for a system that prioritizes profit over everything else? Why, America can't cope if they were sanctioned by major trading partners and by 190 nations on earth. You operate on a trade deficit every year, about $1 trillion worth. That means that you import $1 trillion worth of goods more than you export, and you're importing things that you can't produce yourselves. Yeah, I know it sounds like this is going to make your life harder, but this is a process of struggle and sacrifice that you're going to have to go through to wrestle your way out of corporate domination. With Article 6 campaign, we can envision a world where the power of these corporations is shattered. When the sanctions come, when American businesses lose their grip on global markets, the stranglehold that corporations have on the American people will weaken. Without the profits that fuel their domination, these corporations will lose their influence over the government, over the economy, over every aspect of American life. Look, the American economy, the military-industrial complex, has long been propped up by the exploitation of the world and the manufacture of conflicts across the globe by means of using the United Nations. Well, wait until that system contracts. The collapse of the old system will make way for something new, something better, something moral, inshallah. We're working towards a future where Wall Street, that temple of greed and corruption, is brought to its knees. When the sanctions hit, the stock market will tremble and the dollar will weaken. It's not something to fear. This is something to welcome. When the financial markets are in turmoil, the power of the corporate elite will be shaken. The American people will have the chance to demand a new economic model that serves the many and not just the few. We're pushing for a future where these multinational behemoths, which have robbed people of their livelihoods and of their dignity, get dismantled. We're striving for a world where the U.S. no longer has the power to intimidate and to oppress. We want to see America forced to turn inward, to look at the rot within its own borders, to face the crimes that it has committed against its own people. The government will have no choice but to rehabilitate itself, to reform its institutions, the institutions that they have used to oppress their own citizens for far too long, because those entities that control your government, your government today, those private sector entities, will lose their dominance. Our struggle is not just about the immediate effects that sanctions, for example, might bring, but long-term change. We're fighting for a world where the U.S. is no longer the center of the world, when the power of the dollar is diminished, when global trade is realigned with the people, not just the corporations. And within America, we're fighting for a future where the government is forced to serve its people, to protect their rights, to ensure where the government is forced to rehabilitate itself, to end mass incarceration, to end police brutality, to end all of their domestic violations of international law, and behave like a civilized nation among all of the other nations of the world, not as a global hegemon that thinks that it is above the law and acts above the law even with regards to their own citizens. Wallahi, the day will come, and it won't be long, when America is no longer the master of the world, but just a nation among nations, and will be accountable to the people that it has oppressed for so long. And on that day, the American people will be free, truly free, for the first time in their history. And that begins with you signing the petition, the Article 6 petition for the invocation of Article 6. And it begins with the expulsion of the United States from the United Nations.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. To everyone who has joined us during the video, I'll just reiterate what we inshallah will be going through. So I want to welcome you first of all to our discussion inshallah. And today we were just listening to the video by our brother Shahid Bolson titled Liberating Americans from America. Okay, so in this video, instead, try to explore and highlight this disconnect between this identity, right, of being American and the realities of those people labeled as minorities, right, within the US. So, we'll try to challenge this notion of American identity, right, arguing that, most of the people are a part of the global majority, right, and they're misrepresented by being called Americans. And we'll try to dissect, the injustices in the system, which are being normalized, right? So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, to start off, let us look at the first part, right? So, in the first part, and then I will, inshallah, invite our host and co-host to speak. So in the first part, Brother Shahid, right, he delves into this psychological entrapment, right, which, this entrapment can be like identifying as American, right? And this is particularly for minority communities. And, this labeling, it doesn't just reinforce this narrow worldview, but it also obscures a broader connection that these minorities might have to the global majority, right? So, by challenging these labels, we can try to decolonize ourselves from this, right? And we can break free from this colonial mindset that has been perpetuated through Western narratives, right? So, inshallah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, I would like to ask, our speakers, how does this notion of being an American serve as some sort of psychological barrier, right, that tries to separate individuals from their inherent belonging, right, to the global majority? And how can we deconstruct this, American identity?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi ala alaihi. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له في الأرض ولا في السماء وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله وخاتم أنبيائه صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه صلاة دائمة إلى يوم اللقاء. وبعد, first of all, I'm honored to share this space with all of you. I appreciate our hosts facilitating the space to have this critical discussion, and I feel honored to be able to even be here and to speak on such a tremendous subject. The notion of being a quote-unquote American, even so-called American, especially when we look at how the title of America, of being an American, is essentially the label that reflects the complete elimination of every culture that led to people being a part of this nation. It's a psychological barrier insofar as that America could never exist without the global majority. Everyone who is here as citizens, outside of the mass extermination of the natives to this land, carry the title American only through governance, but not because America in and of itself is a culture or is a place. Nothing about being American is original. It is the compilation, in many ways, it is the cultural Frankenstein. It is taking components of not just Western colonialism and European imperialism, which caused people to run here in the first place, and then became the very monster that it sought to defeat by replicating the same hideous tactics that existed where the so-called Puritans came from, and then replicating that there, but then importing people from all over the world to build the country. And then after the country was built, turning everyone into wage slaves, reducing our cultural and ethnic identity to just colors, as if you could be black. I mean, I look at this screen here. It's my first time ever on the X Space. I appreciate the brother who allowed for me to log in to participate in this discussion. I see the color black. I see like that the screen is black. I've never met a human being that's color. That's the color that they are. So even like the elimination of identity by even pitting, white versus black, good versus evil, that fair and lovely culture. If it's not white, it's not right. I mean, when we say America, the psychological barrier that inevitably exists is, first of all, saying that being American makes you better than everyone else. But then being American makes you marginalized compared to other Americans. And even the identity of the people who are American, the generations that allowed for them to be here in the first place, is completely shattered. It's completely stripped from them. This is the antithesis of human nature. You can't even say it's subhuman. It's inhumane at every single level. From a Quranic perspective, Allah Azza wa Jalla, the creator, the fashioner, the sustainer of everything that exists, that honored the children of Adam by giving us intellect, creating us from different tribes and different nations so that we could come together and to get to know one another. That is the whole premise of why we are different. In Surah Rum, chapter 30, verse number 22, verses 20 through 22, the whole reason for different races and different languages, this is a sign from Allah. But then to reduce that and to say, that to be American and to speak English, and it just the complete bastardization of intelligence by limiting our ability to branch out, to appreciate the vastness of the diversity of the world that Allah created for us to embrace as a means of knowing God. No wonder being American lends itself to godlessness. The fact that Allah, Ya ayyuhan nas, Ya bani Adam, when Allah calls on us as a collective to remember our essence, our origin, Surah Nisa, chapter 4, verse number 1, He created us from one soul, then from two, and brought out of them many men and many different women. So that for what reason, for what purpose, other than to connect with each other as a means of connecting with God Almighty. The disempowerment that comes from not knowing yourself, because your identity, your heritage, your culture has not only been completely eradicated from you, but then it's been replaced by football, basketball, fast food, and everything. I mean, the psychological barriers are manifold. It's multifaceted. It's sick, and it's scary. It's scary that although Allah had honored us with intellect, the Western propaganda of replacing the mindset of what makes a person and what makes that person happy, while replacing all of the organic, beautiful attributes of humanity with all of these inorganic, artificial pursuits of secularist and hedonistic goals, as if our purpose in life is to just live, satisfy our stomach and our private parts, and then die. I mean, that is at its fundamental core what an American is. That's the American dream, as Sheikh Shahid so eloquently described it, as an American nightmare. So I don't want to rant too much more, and I hope I didn't go on a tangent beside the points, but that's just some of the components that come to mind readily on the notion of being a quote unquote so-called American.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Just thinking about, I haven't, alhamdulillah, I haven't lived in America for, over 20 years now. And so, I'm, to a certain extent, I have a double view. I have a view as someone who is intimately familiar with my own society where I grew up, but also a view from the outside. And then there's having lived outside of the U.S. for so long, and having lived outside of the culture and the society, it's a very different experience
when you have become used to dealing with people, especially fellow Muslims, when you become used to dealing with fellow Muslims and then also just used to dealing with people from outside of the United States, it's a completely different experience when you encounter an American. I've talked about it before, that whenever I talk to an American, whenever I have to talk to an American, I kind of go into that interaction assuming that I'm dealing with someone who's not normal. That's a shame. And I think everyone outside of America approaches it the same way. You know, even if they don't consciously realize that this is what they're doing, you have to make adjustments when you're talking to an American. You kind of lower your expectations. You know, you go into it knowing that you're not going to have a normal interaction. I mean, this isn't just true of Americans specifically, as Westerners generally, but very specifically about Americans. It's very much the case that, like, for example, if I'm talking to an American, I don't know whether or not the person sitting across from me is even sober or not, because at least half of the population drinks alcohol regularly. 1 out of every 5 Americans is an alcoholic. I think it's something like 1 in 3 do drugs, and at least 1 in 6, I think, 1 in 6 Americans are either misusing or abusing prescription drugs at any given time. Not to mention 1 out of every 5 Americans has some sort of mental, psychological, or emotional disorder. I mean, this is a big thing that they talk about, the mental health crisis. We've talked about that before. So literally, you never know what you're going to get when you sit down and talk to an American. You know, from if you're overseas and you encounter an American. These are people that don't value the sanctity of their own minds, their own cognition. They're willing to abuse their own brains, and they act like this isn't a major issue. Well, it is a major issue. You know, this is a people who habitually inflict self-harm on their own ability to reason and to think. It's no wonder that so many Americans subscribe to some very strange ideas and beliefs and conspiracy theories and so on. Something like 2/3 of all Americans believe in conspiracy theories. Just under half of all Americans believe in things like astrology and ghosts and UFOs and aliens and lizard people and what have you, reincarnation, manifestation, all these quasi spiritual New Age beliefs and whatnot, superstitions. So this is a people who don't take their own minds seriously. And this is what their culture has done to them. This is what their society has done to them. You're alienating yourselves from the rest of the planet. This is what you get out of thinking of yourself as being American and confining yourself to being an American. 1/3 of Americans are below literacy levels and haven't even read a book in the last year, in the last 12 months. Not to mention that they're so heavily propagandized, indoctrinated, and manipulated by their own media and their own schools. And most Americans don't even leave the United States. I think it's less than half of Americans even have a passport. So the chances are very low. If you come across a random American, the chances are very low that person is not under the influence of alcohol or drugs or medication, mental illness, misinformation, disinformation, miseducation, or ignorance. This is what your society has done to you, and it doesn't make any sense for someone. Now, I'm not even talking about the issue of someone being a so-called minority in the United States, whereas in reality, as I said in the video, in reality, you're part of the global majority. You know, it's very straightforward for us, for Muslims, as an ummah. We're a nation beyond borders. So we have that sense of identity and that sense of belonging. And if you, as a Muslim, allow yourself to lose track of that, then you're allowing yourself to be sabotaged in the same way that Americans, who are so-called minority groups, and again, like I said, also, we're not just talking about racial and ethnic minorities, although that's a major issue, but also even economically. But even for non-Muslims, you know, even for non-Muslims, they can actually define for themselves with whom they feel solidarity and a shared identity. It seems to me that many people in the U.S. or in the West generally actually have more in common these days with people in the global South than they have in common with this fabricated artificial American identity, except for the the symptoms of and the dysfunction that American society has inflicted upon them. Like I said, I think in the video, most people in the U.S. and most people in the world are financially struggling. The global, 0.1%, and the American 0.1% have nothing to do with people's lives and experience around the world, and nothing to do with the lives and experience of Americans. We're locked out of power, and you're locked out of power. We're oppressed by your elites, and you're oppressed by your elites. And they don't draw borders on the basis of identity for themselves. I mean, the American power structure doesn't treat themselves like they're American. They think that they're citizens of the world. They think that they have a right to rule from the Philippines to Brazil. They think every country is their business. Whatever any country does anywhere in the world is their business. They feel entitled. The connection that they feel to the rest of the world is an entitlement to rule all of these other countries in the world and to determine what their domestic internal policies should be. But the average regular American person, American citizen, rank and file American citizen, feels no connection whatsoever with people who are almost identical to them in their circumstances and their conditions, who's on the other side of the planet, even though the conditions of that person on the other side of the planet is being determined by the same people who are determining your condition. So you're really self-sabotaging when you think of yourself and you allow yourself to be put in this box that separates you from the rest of the people of the world who have so much in common with you.
Yeah, I just want to briefly add to that point. Wa barakallahu feek. As an American, we can relate to the impoverishment, to the marginalization, the disenfranchisement, but the global community cannot relate or connect with the drug abuse, the alcohol, the sex, the violence that is exported from here to their parts of the world, and in many ways, ethically, spiritually, morally rejected by everyone else, despite the attempts of the propaganda to paint everyone else as exactly what Americans are. But even then, it's not all Americans that get to enjoy the fruits of being a so-called American. I remember when I converted to Islam, it was I was with a few brothers, and one of them was wearing this white shmal, like a cloth, the kind that you wear over your head or your shoulders as a man. And I was like, wow, that's really beautiful. Like, what's that called? And he explains to me like a kafia and, these types of garments and stuff. And I was like, I've never seen anything like that. That's really nice. And he literally took it off of his shoulders and he put it around mine. And I was like, what are you doing? He was like, here, just take it. I was like, do you have two of the same kind? He said, no. I said, then I can't take this from you. This is yours. He's like, no, now it's yours. Because faith is to love for your brother what you love for yourself. So the same way I love for me to have it, I love for you to have it. I still have that cloth to this day. And that was over 11 years ago. But I remember then, and I remember now when I wear it, that was the first time I truly experienced generosity from a stranger. And that generosity is a human trait. It is a human characteristic. But the superiority complex that so-called Americans experience is defined through this individualism, me, myself, and I. When the global South, when Islam, when the global community is empowered through their collectivism, that's what gives strength to the individual. But to just be a part of this sort of, like I said, a Frankenstein culture where everyone is stealing from everything else, exporting all of the negativity to everywhere else, and then your strength is in being by yourself. No wonder we, are sort of given this notion that we are better than everyone else, but we have the types of issues that show just how lowly on a subconscious level we see ourselves. We have to drink our problems away, smoke our problems away, we can't have real relationships with people. So the pornographic industry thrives. Everyone is dealing with some types of addiction or mental health issue. And these problems are escalating with time, despite us being the so-called superior group.
Thank you very much, Brother Shahid and Brother Turaabi. And I think this is highlighted in the video in this prison analogy, right? This like psychological state that, people feel in, right? Like, in the video, it was essentially comparing like the experiences of these minority communities in America to inmates, right? Who mistakenly believe that they're like part of this prison staff, right? So, there's this psychological manipulation experienced by these communities, all right, that they like make them feel as if they are an integral part in the system, whereas the system actually oppresses them, right? Like, and I think this is very similar to, the topic that was discussed in one of Ustaz's videos, which was called the Pharaoh's Palace, right? Like that the slaves in this palace, they deemed themselves as superior, right, to the people outside of the palace, even though they had much more in common with the people being oppressed outside the palace, right? So I would maybe want to address this, like there's this sort of cognitive dissonance, right, where you essentially feel like you need to please, the ones that are keeping you inside the palace, right? As if these are your masters, but like they're the ones oppressing you, right? And you can feel it every day and, over the decades, right? So, like, how to get out of this state, right? How to get out of this mental state where, as you said, right, there's this superiority complex of being American, but inferiority complex of being a minority, right? So you have these two opposing things, I feel like, that they exist inside, these minorities, where they feel like that they're privileged to be American to a certain degree, but they feel oppressed in being in America, right? So I think it's a very difficult state to be in, right? So I would like, how can we break free from this mental colonization, right, and reject the system of oppression that is essentially being perpetrated?
Yeah, I actually made that comparison to inmates based on my own experience in prison. As everyone knows, I was in prison for 7.5 years. And in prison, you have, in Arabic, mukhbir. Someone who's a mukhbir means an informer or a snitch, someone who collaborates with the prison administration. And they always think that they are, they really believe and feel about themselves as if they work for the prison, as if they are part of the prison administration, and they get some kind of privileges as a result of them informing against other inmates. But it's important to point out that there are no inmates in the prison for whom the prison administration has more contempt than their own informers and their own snitches. They have no respect whatsoever for the people who are mukhbirin, the people who are informers and who are snitches. They just use them and manipulate them and have no respect for them. And even if you have some kind of privileges, like for example, the prison guard, the people who actually work for the prison, they get to walk around the prison freely, obviously. And as an informer, you might get the privilege of being able to walk between different wards of the prison and go to the prison library or go to the canteen or what have you, based on having betrayed a fellow inmate. So you should be able to identify this difference. The only way that you get any privileges is by betraying your own, the people who are in the same condition as you, in the same situation as you, and by serving the interests of the power structure of that institution. Whereas the people who actually work for that institution they automatically have those privileges. And this is the case for so-called minority groups, and also again for the economically deprived in the U.S., regardless of what their race or ethnicity is. You have to work to get the things that are supposed to be your rights. So this just gives the lie to the whole concept of citizenship in America and the West generally. The very fact that they even have the term minority in a country where everyone is a citizen. You're supposed to all be equal. But if you're a so-called minority, or if you're poor, if you're from the underclass, you have to work to get the rights that the other people have just automatically. All of your rights you have to work for. You have to fight for. Or you have to, as I say, sell out your own people. You have to sell out your own community in order to get the rights that other people have automatically. And so it's exactly the same as a mukhbar in prison, as a snitch or an informer in prison. It's exactly the same. You don't get it automatically. And as I say in the video, the people who actually work for the prison, the people who are actually part of the prison administration, they won't hesitate to remind you about what your place is if you step out of line. They are the ones who have the power to punish you. They have the power to remove your privileges. And that's the case in the U.S. That's the case in really all of the Western countries, that talk about freedom and liberty and democracy and justice and so on, and equality. I mean, on the one hand, like I said, on the one hand, they talk about equality, but at the same time, they talk about minorities in their country. Why is this even a term that you have? Except that it's very clear and very obvious that different people are treated different ways. So it's exactly like in a prison. I'm not sure how you can break out of it, except for what I mentioned in the video, is to stop defining yourself according to the way that they're defining you, according to the way that the power structure is defining you, according to the way that the elites are defining you, because they're not defining you that way for your best interest. They're defining you that way for their best interest. And just like I was talking about and Brother Turaabi was talking about, they subject you to a culture and an indoctrination. Popular culture itself, mainstream culture, mainstream media, and what have you, popular media, music, movies, television, so on. All of that represents a form of indoctrination, and that indoctrination instills in you behavioral qualities, behavioral traits, moral qualities, or rather immoral qualities that do alienate you from the rest of the people in the world. Because nobody is like you people. Nobody is the same way you are, like I said. And so when they do have to deal with you, they're dealing with someone. They approach that interaction like I'm dealing with someone who's not normal, that's not like me. Even though we actually share so much in terms of our circumstances and our conditions, but they have created in you personality dysfunctions that make it impossible for anyone to relate to you, and that interfere with you being able to relate to them. So I think it's really essential for Americans and for Westerners generally, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, to try to stop thinking of yourself according to the definitions that are set for you by the people who themselves don't even look at you as a citizen of the country.
Yeah, just briefly, what comes to mind in the dichotomy drawn with Pharaoh's palace and this notion of freedom and inclusion within the American society, where there are marginalized citizens that are supposed to be all equal to one another, right? Freedom and equality and all of these things, apple pies and bald eagles and American dream. And, the first thing that comes to mind is the hadith, the prophetic statement narrated from Abu Huraira, found in the collection of Imam Muslim. Ad-dunya sijnul mu'min wa jannatul kafir. That this world is a prison for the believer, a person with faith, and a paradise for the disbeliever, a person who has no faith. And that analogy, I want to kind of just briefly draw a parallel between that and Pharaoh, Fir'aun. Pharaoh thought that he was God. He literally said, "Wa ana rabbukumul a'la." I am your creator, the most high. He saw himself as that over not just the slaves in his society, but even the elites in his society, Haman and Qarun, like even the people who were not enslaved, like the Hebrews, were less than to him from his perceived and delusional sense of grandeur, of being above and greater than everyone else. But that disgusting mindset made him a far more subservient prisoner than even his own so-called slaves. He was in more of a prison within his delusion than even Musa and Harun, Moses and Aaron, who were trying to free the children of Israel. And that deception of perceiving himself as a god in Egypt, standing over the delta of the Nile River, that spills into the Red Sea, his delusion in thinking that he had more power and more might than everyone else around him. It led to the same delusion of a man who saw a sea split in half, and people go into it and thinking, I can go too. The same waters that he perceived himself to be a god over were the same waters that he inevitably drowned in. And the same power that, unfortunately, because of propaganda, Westerners are constantly bombarded with, this notion of money equaling power and freedom. Being a wage slave and thinking that money gives you freedom is a delusion, because freedom is not something that can be bought. It's a part of reinforcing that alienating mindset, because elsewhere in the world, people understand that monetary value will only get you so far. Eventually, you have to have some semblance of substance. And that semblance of substance is what gives a person true liberty and true justice. But when those concepts are manipulated and distorted and saying like, yes, equal and empowered. I mean, there's a notion of freedom. I can identify as any gender I want, and I can even change my gender, allegedly, if I want. Has now led to a notion of freedom that has created the most psychologically oppressed and socially repressed human beings on the face of the planet, where sexuality is freedom, but now you're a lifelong patient. Like what kind of delusion is that? Now that's just talking about, some of these more prevalent agendas that serve as distractions from what true freedom actually is: freedom of thought, freedom of faith, freedom of connecting with people despite our differences. So yes, indeed, it is. We are prisoners within our society only because we've considered the society to be like a Jannah, a paradise. Going back to Sheikh Shahid's analogy, the notion of, you have this snitch in prison who, just because he gets a little more extra food on his tray, and just because, he gets a little more extra time in the yard, and, the guards are a little nicer to him, like, yeah, I'm winning, I'm succeeding. Those guards go home, the warden goes home, and you go back to your cell. And that little bit of quote unquote privilege is a delusion to make you think that you are somehow better than the people that you are essentially making life harder for. It's like the house Negro. Even to this day, within the African American community, there's this notion of like crabs in a bucket. This idea of, I tear you down, I hold you back to lift myself up. And even Sheikh Shahid had mentioned this notion of like, even the only merit of being white in America is that you're just not black, because poor white people are considered to be white trash, so-called white trash. Trash, calling another human being trash because of what? Paper with dead presidents' faces on it and a number and a bank account, as if this is what gives you freedom? No, unequivocally, without fail, you are most certainly in a prison. And the only thing that will really liberate you from that, it's got to start on an imanic level. It has to start at a faith-based level and then lend itself to a true pursuit of spiritual equality, of spiritual empowerment, and understanding that our skin color and our money is not what makes us different. Rather, it's our status in the eyes of God Almighty.
Thank you very much, brother. Brother Ali, would you like to add something?
Yes, but I'm going to be a little more technical. Wow, that was amazing. Watching how America has degenerated the so-called minority class is it's such a painful thing to look at. I'll try to go down the list of the so-called minorities, starting with the natives. They finally, once they were done with their genocide and they got rid of most of them, they created an entire holiday based on feeding them turkey in a way to whitewash that genocide. But they then stuck them into reservations and said, here, we're going to give you this land and you can live there and it's yours, and this is our way of saying sorry for what we did. And as an added bonus, our laws don't apply on your reservations. So if you look at this, they're clearly stating that we're going to help you foster a life of crime on these reservations. because we're going to isolate you from having a normal life and a good life within American land. But on your reservation, you can do what you want. So, of course, the reservations all of a sudden are filled with casinos. They're pressing bullets for guns. They're doing all the things that you can't do on American soil. So it fostered a life of crime. And of course, with that comes alcoholism and growing drugs. And now alcoholism is really plaguing the native population. Like per capita, I think it's the worst in America. They're just known for being alcoholics. They have no representation in Congress. I mean, the last person to try and represent the natives was a white woman named Elizabeth Warren. She was like 1/100th native and literally used that to try and be the representative for the natives. And that's unfortunate. As for the offspring of the slaves after the so-called end of slavery, which never really ended, it just took new masks. They realized that Black Americans, and forgive me, I'm just going to use the word black, are very, very strong-willed. They're not easy to take down, and they have systemically never stopped trying to break them down. I mean, when they were violent, it was like, look at these barbaric people with no etiquette and no intelligence, and they just painted them as these animals and felt okay going into their neighborhoods and destroying their lives, and brought drugs into it, infiltrated it, slowly destroying their very family, which the Black family used to be a very strong unit and a very strong society. And then, of course, they got smarter and they realized, okay, violence is just getting us shot and arrested, making it bad. So, here comes Martin Luther King with the approach of nonviolence and trying to promote the need for civil rights for Black American in a more constructive manner. But and here comes the next infiltration, which is to try and promote different leaders above these amazing intellectuals. I remember Malcolm X in an interview mocking how the white liberal is trying to push the entertainer as a Black leader. He was making fun of Lena Horne and all these other sports and musician people that were being pushed as Black leaders. But slowly and surely they did get there. They made those the leaders of Black America. And I actually, with relation to, since we're dealing with the genocide in Palestine, there is a interesting piece of history when it comes to Black America, which is when the Genocide Convention was introduced in the United Nations. It was ratified near unanimously. All members ratified it except for the United States of America. And their excuse at the time was they didn't want their sovereignty challenged by a foreign body. Imagine that. It was basically a roundabout way of saying, we don't want to suffer the consequences of some of what we've done. And it was W.E.B. Du Bois and multiple other activists that got this paper together called We Charge Genocide and attempted to go to United Nations to try and hold America accountable for what they did during slavery. And my God, the chicanery that America did to get rid of this problem. I mean, one, W.E. Du Bois ended up being classified as an unregistered foreign agent so that he can be deterred from traveling. Willie McGee was executed after he was controversially convicted of rape by an all-white jury. Francis Grayson, one of the Martinsville Seven, was also executed after a much publicized trial and convicted again, of course, by an all-white jury. And little by little, they tried to kill this and stop them from being able to. There was one more person, I forget his name, but they got him arrested in England, and he had to turn in his passport. But little by little, they killed this until Malcolm X showed up and tried to bring it back up again.
Thanks a lot, Brother Ali. I want to maybe hear Sister Imane, because I remember you used to talk about you used to talk about this manipulation of words, and I think it's very relevant, and I liked your idea. Like 2 weeks ago you spoke about it, so if you can give us a hint about how it's related to this, please.
Absolutely, Jazakallah khair. I did want to talk about the manipulation of language, and it reverts back to what Brother Ibn Adam was speaking about and Brother Shahid was talking about earlier. And the idea that people think they're free because they use the same words as their oppressors. I mean, this belief that the group who oppresses you can be the same group that offers you this freedom and rights needs to actually be rethought and re-believed, because people need to understand that when we use certain words like freedom and rights, and the governments use the same words as us, they're not using the same definitions as us. They're using the same words but different definitions, and you end up accidentally falling into the same definitions that they're using. So essentially what they do is they take these words like freedom and rights and they switch their definitions with their opposites, like oppression and terrorism, to make their own populations, obviously within propaganda, within their own countries, especially within the United States, they make their own people believe that what their country is doing domestically and internationally is something that is objectively morally correct, and they twist the truth in their favor. So essentially when you believe that you are free, you are believing in their definition of freedom. When you are not actually free, you don't have financial freedom like what Brother Shahid was talking about earlier. I think it may have been actually in the video where he was talking about it's illegal to be homeless, but they don't give you the opportunity not to be homeless. They actually force you into homelessness. And so you cannot possibly believe that the people, the same powerful who create this world for you, give you 100 problems, are going to be the ones who fix these 100 problems for you. You can't accept them to be your saviors. You can't accept their definitions of certain words. And I do want to just quickly revert back to what Brother Ali was talking about earlier. Not what he was talking about, but he said, I'm just going to use the word black. And I think it's very important to talk about the manipulation of language within talking about certain ethnicities. I mean, there is segregation within the United States of America just through the language that they use. They call black people, people from Africa, they call them African Americans. They call people Asian Americans. They call people Muslim Americans. But when you're white, you're just American. And that is a form of segregation, to be able to separate between who is truly American, and I said that in air quotes, and then somebody who is still a foreigner to them, an alien to them. And so essentially what people need to understand is you need to, when you see these people in power start speaking about these kinds of things, please do dissect what they are saying in a way where you will truly understand the motive behind what they are saying, not just hearing the words that they are saying and accepting it to be truth. Because when we look at propaganda, we know that propaganda needs to have truth in it to be able to manipulate people. So they are going to give you a bit of truth masked in a whole lot of lies. So please do understand that the language that you use cannot be the same language of your oppressors. You cannot be using the same tactics as your oppressors and believing your oppressors and believing the same people who are giving you 100 problems, solving one for you and accepting that they're your saviors.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I just want to add to what everyone has been saying, mashallah, regarding how America uses the legal system, for to appear that, it's, inclusive, it's democratic and all that. Like when I'm from the global south. I'm not an American, but whenever I used to discuss how things were really, unfair in the US, or there is something that they are doing that is just wrong. I was always told that, the US, they have the legal system. At least they have that. That's the answer that I usually get. That at least there is some, law in place that that people need to invoke or use to keep their rights. And for example, simple one would be the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Well, you think that, well, wow, that's great, which is great indeed on paper, because it did dismantle the segregation and all that. However, this is the legal reform, they will call it, and that gives it the impression that all citizens, regardless of what race or ethnicity they have the same rights and opportunity. But we know in reality that, like everyone has been saying, that that's not true, because they are not tackling the core matter, like things like the mass incarceration that was mentioned, the systemic voter suppression that was also mentioned. All these are not really, these are systemic. This means it's very deep. It's beyond the legal system. The legal system becomes just a tool. It's becoming like a tool to maintain that control while they are projecting this image of inclusivity. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion, because this is the thing that I used to get as an answer, that they have a legal system that preserves the right of everyone. Well, I don't care if that legal system is still not helping, or because it's not in the legal system that is the problem. It's a deeply rooted systemic issue that keeps persisting, whether you have the legal system in place or not. Thank you.
Sister Semira, I think you highlighted a great point that was essentially even in the video, this, these systemic problems that they have, right, that they don't address, right? It's just, superficial, like curing of symptoms without addressing the disease, right? So there was this notion in the video, which was like criminalizing poverty, right? As if like that will deal with it, right? Like Ustaz in that video addresses like the absurdity, right, of criminalizing homelessness, right? So I would like to discuss together like what are the broader implications of such policies, right? And essentially like what are the implications on perception, right, of poverty and justice, right? Like essentially, how does the criminalization of poverty reflect these broader systemic issues within American society, right? Like, let us try to contemplate the moral and ethical implications of penalizing individuals basically for like their socioeconomic status, right? I feel like this contradicts, even like global human rights standards, right? So what does this reveal about, American exceptionalism? And also, what are the alternatives? Like, when one does not address the source, right? And there has been hints at this, that there is the source of the perception of dunya, etc. And I think it's all, of course, related to this, right? Because it's all interconnected, right? You cannot separate too much, right? So what are the alternatives when one does not want to address the source? Like, as I said, this is all they do, right? They never heal the disease itself. So, yeah, let us reflect on these laws and let us try to, what are the implications of these policies?
The policies at their fundamental core exist to protect the oppressor and to continue to remove the advantage of the oppressed from removing the oppression over themselves. Just even like the idea, as was shared, the idea of criminalizing homelessness, but not criminalizing a system that allows for there to be more empty homes in America than actual homeless people. I was just in Detroit a couple of weeks ago, and there was a homeless person that had been essentially stopped by a cop and asked if they had their panhandling license. So, I mean, it was one of the most absurd things that I'd seen. And then I found out that this is actually fairly commonplace, that if a homeless person wants to panhandle, they want to stand on a corner and ask people for money, they have to get permission. They have to go and get a permit to beg people for money. When you juxtapose that against the system of sadaqah, the system of zakah, sadaqah coming from the word sidq, which means truthfulness. We translate it as charity, but it's an extension of honesty, of sincerity. When you look at the concept of zakah, we translate it to, almsgiving is sort of a weird translation, but you'll see that sometimes in older texts with translation. But zakah, it comes from the concept of purification. That's something that you give to someone else that is at a disadvantage, that is disenfranchised, that is marginalized, that is poor. That's good for you. That's a testament to your truthfulness as a human being. That's a testament to your understanding that what you give to someone who needs something is an extension of purification of yourself. And the people who set up these systems that penalize individuals for their socioeconomic status while doubling down on creating a system that widens the gap between the rich and the poor while not facilitating any means of meaningful help for the poor from the rich, they're criminals. And of course, there's no honor amongst thieves. When you share this, a couple of things kind of come to mind, like the ayah from Surah Nisa, chapter 4, verse 135. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawwamin bil qist. Be people who stand up for justice. If you have faith, be someone who stands up for justice. Shuhada lillah. Be people who are witnesses for God Almighty, whether that's against yourself or whether that's against your parents or whether that's against the people that are close to you, whether you be rich, ghaniyan, or whether you be poor, faqiran. That we have a responsibility to stand up for that justice and equality, no matter what. But in a society that rewards that, the criminalization of the disenfranchised by saying, well, there's going to be the haves and the have-nots, and there's going to be, the reason why they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and don't be what's it called? Like it's like a Section 8, or they say like a welfare queen, somebody who is quote unquote, relying upon the government to take care of them. Well, what else are you supposed to do when that same government puts you in a position where you are not physically capable of taking care of yourself? It's a terrible, terrible thing. And the truth is, if the people do not wake up to the reality that today it's these people, it's, the quote unquote minorities. But as that living wage gap continues to grow and more people suffer as a result of it, eventually, it will inevitably find itself knocking on your door, putting you out into the streets. Eventually, we'll all find ourselves in that position. If we don't stand up for that, then of course we're going to continue to suffer from it. One thing that I sort of think of, and I think it's, especially when we start talking about impoverishment and criminalizing really people who are subject to the circumstances that their society has truly put them in, and not like a shifting of blame thing, but no, literally there's quantifiable factors for why that is. Even someone and I will say this, and I apologize if it offends you, this is just my meager opinion, but someone who was as socially or as emotionally deprived as Friedrich Nietzsche, who talked about this concept of will over reason, and before the inception of evolutionary psychology, understanding that, or his understanding was that beliefs are motivated by unconscious will more so than pure reason. And that inevitably, people are going to manifest their moral system predicated upon whatever it is that's going to lead to the greatest self-affirmation. Like he specifically in his book, Thus Spoken Zarathustra, or also in his book on the genealogy of morals, he was mostly talking about Christians, and he criticized that moral system of how with Christianity, they build their identities through the opposition of perceived evil, rather than trying to overcome these faults, and rather than trying to fix the problems and then you create a genuine self-affirmation, and how that lends itself to a master-slave, not mentality, but a sense of morality. How reacting against the dominant master morality, the common enemy, the oppressor, the ruling class, that this is essentially why certain systems are put in place in order to strengthen the strengths of the oppressor and remove any way out from under the oppression by the rulers, by the people who are in power. I mean, there's so many books that are written on this, from Pedagogy of the Oppressed to The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, to Cultural Identity and Global Process by Jonathan Friedman, even Multicultural Education, Critical Pedagogy, and the Politics of Difference by Christine E. Sleater. You have this all being quantified as these powers are put in place as a means of justifying and removing blame from the people who are literally stealing from the poor and making themselves even more rich, like the most toxic form of the inversion of Robin Hood incarnate. And that's why, specifically as Muslims in the West, such as myself, we have an imanic responsibility. We have a faith-based responsibility as called upon by Allah in the Quran, subhanahu wa ta'ala, to step up and to recognize that. But unfortunately, and this will be my last point, because a good speaker knows when to shut up, so I'll try to be a good speaker, at least by now. But one of the things that comes to mind specifically within the Muslim community, who found a way to gentrify suburbia, and if you know what I'm talking about, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's like a lot of the Muslims from the migrant community, second and third generation Muslims from the African world, the Arab world, from the subcontinental or so-called Desi world, have essentially bought in so much to that system that they don't feel really any responsibility to take up the banner that the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him, took up by way of actually reaching out to, connecting with, and trying to empower the disenfranchised within the community. And so I hope I didn't veer too far from the point, but when we start talking about this notion of criminalizing poverty and the systematic criminalization of poverty in America, and deepening the economic disadvantage and pushing it, and how absurd that is, Islam has a system that's meant to actually not necessarily say that wealth is bad, but you have to use your wealth to help those who are in need. But that's like the polar opposite of the system here. You have people who, whether you make six figures, and 50% of people in the United States who make six-figure salaries still live paycheck to paycheck, or whether you're somebody who, quote unquote, doesn't meet the poverty line according to your state's regulations. And so you have no choice but to live paycheck to paycheck, hand to mouth, and even then still need more. There has got to be some semblance of accountability. If it doesn't start with Americans, then it's got to start with so-called Muslim Americans. And if it doesn't start with us, then we can't expect things to change. We can only expect things to continue to get worse.
Thank you very much, brother. Thank you. Brother Shahid, would you maybe like to add something?
Well, to be honest, Brother Turaabi, what he said is absolutely beautiful. There's not much to add to it. I would just, from a slightly different perspective, I would say that it's ironic that Americans are continuously talking about their freedom and how much more free they are than everyone else in the world. Meanwhile, America has literally more laws than any other country on earth. You're literally the most regulated, controlled society that you can imagine, that exists on planet Earth. And yet the people believe in this illusion that they're the most free. It's only possible through indoctrination and brainwashing that can make you not even see yourself, the prison that you're in, and the extent to which you are yourself suppressed and repressed and oppressed by the power structure in the United States. That you are able to tell yourself and convince yourself of how free you are, even though everyone actually knows, kind of going back to what Brother Turaabi was saying, that actually freedom in the United States, in the West generally, but in the United States again specifically, and very dramatically so in the United States, freedom is a privilege that you possess through wealth. If you can join through some means of earning, and it doesn't matter how you earn, as long as you're able to earn wealth, whether it's by cheating, stealing, deception, manipulation, or what have you, if you're able to reach the oppressor class, then you have the freedom that is that America declares is for everyone. But everyone knows that their actual freedom is extremely limited if you don't have the money. Money buys the freedom, so the freedom obviously isn't free. The freedom has to be purchased by means of wealth, and if you don't have the wealth, then you don't have the freedom. all of the laws that exist, as brother said, are to protect the oppressor class and to keep the oppressed from being able to reach the oppressor class. And whatever freedom you have, it's freedoms of behavior that interfere with you ever reaching the oppressor class. The freedom to, for example, be promiscuous, the freedom to do drugs, the freedom to drink alcohol, the freedom to fritter away your life in meaningless activities and in pointless causes, identitarian causes, and what have you. And even as I've talked about before, even the freedom to protest. They don't mind you protesting as long as you're not taking any kind of substantive action. If you're protesting just to let off steam, well, that's something that they will allow, because once you've let off the steam, there's no consequences to that, except potentially your own neighborhood, your own community has been burned and looted. And so all of the freedoms that they give, that actually are available to the financially struggling, to the people who are not from the oppressor class, the freedoms that they give you are all freedoms that only, when you exercise those freedoms, they only sabotage your ability to elevate yourself to the oppressor class. The whole thing is designed to keep you down, and otherwise your freedoms are actually severely limited. As I said, you actually literally have more laws in America than any other country in the world, and yet you proclaim yourselves to be free.
And to that point, I think I believe it was Laura who commented. Hold on, let me try to grab this here. Where is it? Oh, as an American, I can say my experience is that my country wants to keep their heads in the sand. They will pick and choose an issue short term. They then get bored with it or overwhelmed and it goes away. Or MSM tells them it's not an issue anymore. What as an American can we do? Well, I think what our brother Shahid here had shared about how we live in the most regulated society on the face of the planet. Even, again, like the idea of thinking that you're free, but really you're within a prison of delusions and such. Sometimes, and I can say this from my own experience as an American who's never been outside of America, born and raised, has moved around, even like, I could say more about myself, but it's not really that important. But from my experience is that the people are so intellectually and emotionally sedated constantly that we don't have any drive to continue to push things. There is very much a collective, it's a zeitgeist of bystander syndrome, where we're always waiting for someone else to either lead us, or we're waiting for someone else to tell us what we think or what we feel. And in the influencer age, in the social media age, in the fiber optic age, in the quote unquote information age, we can't keep our focus on anything. Now, with your permission, I would like to briefly just go. It's not too much of a tangent, but it is certainly to the point that was shared here. Sorry, I'm still figuring out spaces. So if someone has a comment or anything, I'll try to keep up with it. But just briefly to this point, there's a book by Johann Hari called Stolen Focus. And it mentions actually in the first chapter when discussing some of the research by a person from the Technical University of Denmark, who has done one of the most extensive research projects on collective attention span. And I mean, most of the focus is on Americans because we're the ones outporting the most or exporting the most distractions on the face of the planet. One of the things that he noted is that we receive so much information at a great amount of speed, to an extent that has never been witnessed by human beings on the face of the planet before, that one of the things that we lose in that process of being inundated with so much information, what we lose is depth. So we are constantly being exposed to headlines. We are constantly being exposed to X posts. We're constantly being exposed to this very surface level amount of information, but about a million different things. As a collective, we all have to galvanize behind at least one thing and then pursue the depths of it in order to get a changed result. Even when we look at the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, we, as Muslims, we know this, and anyone who, properly explores Islam, not Googles their way through it or in some rabbit hole on Reddit or something like that, but anyone who really looks into Islam, you'll see that our core message is what's referred to in Arabic as Tawheed, the oneness of God Almighty. And within that framework, it is so heavily driven in that you could literally spend your entire life exploring the nuance and the intricacies and the impact and effect of just belief in one God, and never really even get to crack open other books or dive into other subjects. That's how much depth we apply to even just a single concept. When I think about the United States, when I think about liberating Americans, one of the things that keep us shackled is we have no depth in anything. We don't have depth in our diet. We don't have depth in our fitness. We don't have depth even in our entertainment. We're so docile that we can't generate any traction whatsoever. We're like a tire whose tread has been completely stripped on a slippery road. And anytime we try to get anywhere, the powers that be just add more oil on the ground. So it's like you're going nowhere fast. You're moving, but going nowhere. So we have to be able to explore ways to increase our depth. And I think the Article 6 campaign is one great example of both what it means to get behind something and then pursue its depths without giving up, without tapping out, without fatiguing. But I think the fact that it's so quote unquote, and I say that the progress has been incredible, but from the outside looking in, you see people saying like, oh, what's the point? Or this, that. Same with boycott, divestment, and sanctioning. Oh, what's the point? It's just one person. It's like we can't get past the availability heuristics that make us stop at, it's too much work. It's too much effort. This isn't going anywhere. It's not moving fast enough. So I could honestly say more, but let me shut up there.
This is a great point, actually, and it's related exactly to the next section of the video, which is about this American exceptionalism with respect to, international law, right? And, our brother Shahid in this part, like, he explores, right, the impact of, America's adherence to international law, right? Like, he discusses, how United States essentially positions itself above global legal standards, right? And it fosters this culture of impunity within even its own borders, right? And its foreign policy. So, he critiques, right, like, it's just like, an expression of this Western hegemony, right? So how does this notion of American exceptionalism, right, undermine the enforcement of international law? And this is both domestically and globally, right? Like, we mostly from outside, we see the, violations of international law abroad, right? But, for Americans, you then see it domestically mostly. So, we need these two sides of the coin, right? So let us reflect together, like, how does this attitude affect America's global leadership, right? Its, relationships and its own citizens' rights. Like, how does this affect the mentality of its own citizens and give them this sense of impunity towards, the rest of the world, right? And in this relation, exactly as you mentioned, like, how can movements, like invoking Article 6 campaign catalyze some shift towards like a greater global accountability and even respect for international norms, right? Because that's what we try to stand for, right? That's what we are fighting for, so.
I would like to just address one part. I think that Sister Imane and Sister Nisa and Brother Ali can probably talk more with regards to American exceptionalism on the international stage. But I would just make one more comparison to the situation of a prisoner with regards to American exceptionalism for American citizens. And I'll relate it to my own experience, again, in prison. At one point, I was put in a separate facility, a solitary confinement facility that was sort of a secret prison. And I was told when I was put in that facility, there's no cameras here. No one knows that you're here. The embassy doesn't know. There is no embassy. There's no doctors. There's no human rights. There's no NGOs. And as I say, there's no cameras. That's American exceptionalism and where Americans are in that scenario. The situation that I was in. which is American exceptionalism is lawlessness. Being above the law means lawlessness. You're not subject to any law. And that's great when you're in power. When you're the warden of the prison, when you're the prison guard, that's great for you. You can do whatever you want. But if you're the detainee in that facility, that's a terrible situation for you. They can do whatever they want. They can torture you. They can waterboard you. They can starve you. They can do anything that they want to you in a facility that's outside the bounds of the law. And that's the situation in the United States. America, because of American exceptionalism, because of their basically their proclamation of unilateralism, and we can do whatever we want, and we're not subject to international law. Well, that should make American citizens themselves shudder to the core, because that means that your government can do anything that they want to you, because they're not accountable to anyone for how they treat you. People usually think of it in terms of, beating their chest and saying America will do whatever they want in the world, like the owner of this platform that we're on, saying that America will conduct coups anywhere that they want to around the world. But if you're one of the people who doesn't have power, then it just means again that you are completely helpless with regards to what your government can do to you. The same way that people around the world are helpless to do anything about it when America does something to them. And as I said earlier, the American power structure feels that it's their business to involve themselves and interfere and intrude on the domestic affairs of any country in the world. The same holds true with regards to how they treat their own citizens. And it's exactly like a detainee who's been put into a secret facility that is outside the bounds of the law and outside the bounds of any monitoring or surveillance.
Assalamu alaikum. I'd also like to add regarding American exceptionalism, especially when it comes to, from what I've experienced in South big of a deal to anybody else. But to me, it speaks volumes, because when it comes to the passport, an American, they can come and go as they please within a lot of African countries, but it's more difficult for that same African country to get into America. So that alone is already something showing that they think that they are more important, that they can just do as they please. They can just come and go as they please. Their passport is more powerful, whatever. And although it is not equated to violence or that type of thing, it is a mindset of that they are superior. And a second example of what happened recently in South Africa, recently, not that recent, when there was this thing, BRICS summit was being held in South Africa 3, and there was all this talks about, is Vladimir Putin coming? Is he going? Is he not? Are we going to arrest him? All that type of thing. Then the United States diplomat, made a statement that actually caused South Africa quite a bit of turmoil, with regards to the narrative, with regards to our reputation, where he said he will bet his life that we supply weapons to Russia without any proof. But he was believed just because he was American. And that alone, is a problem that we find across the globe. Just because you hear this person is American, he's got the accent, whatever the case may be, he's automatically believed, he's automatically trusted. Unfortunately, same worth when it comes to white people. People will automatically assume, this person is trustworthy, whatever comes out of their mouths, you can't believe it. Maybe you need to double check somebody else, but not this person. You still have that subconsciously, and it has a lot to do with colonization, where they have enforced that is their image. And they still believe that is who they are, yet they also know that they do not act in the way that their image portrays them to be. So we as people, the global South, whether we white, Indian, black, color, whatever the case may be, whatever we are, we need to understand that it starts with us believing that we are equal. And luckily for us, as Muslims, Islam already teaches us that we are equal. And it is just about everybody else that needs to also get to the program that we need to level the playing field when it comes to American exceptionalism, need to crush that and ensure that, we all are on the same equal playing field.
Mashallah, sister. Yeah, exactly. And this was even like the point of the video, right? You have much more in common as, minorities in your country with the rest of the world, right? Like, don't consider yourself American, consider yourself global, right? And this is, a big psychological hurdle for a lot of people, right? They confine themselves into these, made up walls, right? Which do not have to be there at all. And they were imposed upon you by your oppressor that you deem as your superior or something, right? Which is, that's the whole idea of this, again, this cognitive dissonance state, right? So, maybe I would like to ask Sister Imane, because I know she's very involved in this, invoking the Article 6. So, like, I'd like to ask, like, how do you think that a movement like this, right? Because, again, as Brother Turaabi said, people lose hope or they lose motivation and they say, it has no meaning, it's useless, etc., right? So, like, why are you involved, for example, in Article 6 campaign, right? Like, how do you view it that it can catalyze some shift towards, like, greater accountability, right? For its members. And, essentially, it's all about justice and respect for international norms. Like, we, 190 nations around the world, we decided this is going to be the norm. So please, everyone, abide by it, right? That's the purpose. And that's what we are, fighting for. We're not trying to impose our own values on the world. We're not trying to, convince anyone about something that he doesn't want to do. This is what we agreed upon, right? This is what's on paper. So, how can essentially this campaign help us, to shift towards, this system of greater justice, right?
Well, yeah, I am heavily involved in the invocation of Article 6, alhamdulillah. I genuinely do believe that the invocation of Article 6 is the most powerful thing we can do to be able to restore peace and justice across the entire world. I mean, well, for example, the US government allows you to protest, they allow you to speak out, because they know that these kinds of things don't really hold too much power. And referring back to the comment that Brother Turaabi was answering to earlier, they know that within time people are just going to give up, because the government won't allow change to come from that. They give you this freedom because essentially they say, well, you can have freedom of speech as long as we're not listening. Right? So, when we are trying to invoke Article 6, what we're essentially trying to do is removing the United States of America from the United Nations. If you didn't know what that was, the Article 6 itself is an article within the United Nations Charter that says you can remove any country that has persistently violated the principles contained in the present charter, by the Security Council, by the General Assembly per recommendation from the Security Council. And I do believe that this is the most powerful thing we can do, because we're taking it up from a civilian level to a more diplomatic level. We're taking it to the highest, level of the highest body within the United Nations, which is the Security Council. And essentially, I do believe that removing the US from the United Nations will have a great impact on the entire world, because if we refer back to the video of Brother Shahid talking, he speaks about the economic sanctions that can be put on the United States of America and the inevitability of a reform within the system in the United States of America, and how they will change and inevitably have to cut down or even stop these violations of the international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter domestically. And it's very important for a lot of Americans to realize that what's going on in your country is not just something that is bad. It's not just abnormal to have these school shootings. It's not just abnormal to have 650 mass shootings last year. It is quite literally against multiple conventions, against the principles of the United Nations Charter, against international law. It's against the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. This is something that you can take up with the United Nations, but because of American exceptionalism, because of the fact that they have established their hegemony worldwide, they don't even allow you as civilians who have the right to take everything to a higher level. They don't give you that possibility because they've established that they are the kings on the board, right? They are the ones who take control of everything. So when you look at 1,163 killings from the United States Police last year, that is not normal. Those are extrajudicial killings. Again, referring back to the videos, that is not normal. Those police officers shouldn't be tried by other police officers in courts in Arizona or in Columbus or any city that Brother Shahid mentioned earlier. Those people should be tried in the ICC as criminals on an international level, because what they are doing is violating international law. Everything that the United States of America does within their own country that you may deem to be bad, think of it as the worst thing in the world. Always analyze what they are doing and realize that what they're doing is completely terrible, especially when we look at the millions of lives that they've taken globally, the fact that they've established their hegemony across so many countries, destabilized so many countries, stolen so many resources, and what they've done is they've authorized their war crimes through the United Nations, through this abuse of the veto power that they have, through this financial abuse of the United Nations by withholding their payments and everything, to be able to establish this power globally. So this megalomania that they have, this urge to make more money and get more power, is what is destabilizing the entire world. And we always go by the no justice, no profit principle. And what we want to do is we have a petition that needs to be up to 100,000 signatures. We are already on over 90,000 signatures. Then we take it to a diplomatic, bureaucratic level. We start lobbying member states to be able to remove the United States of America from the United Nations. And I genuinely do believe that this is the most powerful thing as civilians we have done against the United States of America ever. I don't think anyone has ever done anything so powerful against the US, because the US has always been too powerful. And this exceptionalism that they have, this idea of the power that they have right now, is more of a perception that people have, because the US is not as powerful as it was at the end of World War II. It is not as powerful as it was 20 years ago, nor is it as powerful as it was 10 years ago. Over the last 3 years, there has been a shift towards the global south and BRICS. Even BRICS countries hold a higher GDP, a higher global GDP than the G7. So we know that economically there has been a shift towards the global south and BRICS. We know that politically and socially, politically, there has been a shift towards the global south and a shift away from the West. And there has been an isolationism that has occurred within the United States of America that we need to utilize to be able to help the people of the United States of America stop their own government from doing these literally illegal things to them, and stop them from violating international law and violating the principles of the United Nations within their own country, which is that is an inevitability. And finally, to be able to stop the United States of America on imposing sanctions, that they call them sanctions. So basically destabilizing many economies, destabilizing politics in multiple different countries, getting involved with coups and getting involved with the elections of multiple different countries. That's what we need to do. And I genuinely think this is the most powerful thing that we can do as civilians, not protests. I mean, protests, you're getting your voice out there. The BDS movement, you're halting a lot of economic action. But the most powerful thing you can do is remove the wolf from the kindergarten. The kindergarten is a place where there are children, there are people who deserve to be there, and the wolf is in there terrorizing the place. What you need to do is remove the wolf, and the wolf is the United States of America.
MashaAllah, sister. Exactly. I want, any American who is here with us and, listening, this is even for you Americans, right? Like, by invoking Article 6, you will be liberated, inshallah, right, from this oppressive regime that has, subjugated even its own citizens, right? It's not just, about the rest of the world. Of course, it's a big part of it, but it's, for all of the sides, inshallah included. So, by invoking this Article 6, right, as Ustaz mentions in the video, right, I don't want to, run away. It's part of the video. Like, as Sister Imane mentioned, right, that, like, we have not seen a world, or we have not seen even this organization function without the subjugation of it, right? Like, we have yet to see what a world looks like without, this rogue actor being on the scene, right? So, you also mentioned, like, that it's imposing economic sanctions, right? Like economic sanctions are not bad. That's an instrument to be used, but they are again misusing it for their own, purposes, for their own imperialistic like ambitions, right? So, even in the video, Ustad mentioned like that we can impose economic sanctions on bad actors, right? So he explores, the potential impact of these global economic sanctions if they were imposed on the US, right? And like how these measures could, force some reevaluation of American economic policies, right? And, their global consequences and ramifications, right? So, how might imposing economic sanctions on the US serve as some corrective measure for its global economic practices? Like, what is the interplay between, because then he goes on to talk about the global trade and how it can be realigned, right, and more equitable and to be like a mutually beneficial relationship, right? Not just, one-way subjugation, right? So how do these considerations challenge this Western, dominated narrative that like market-driven capitalism, right? They're the only ones who have capitalism. They're the only ones who need to spread it to the world. Everyone else is, authoritarian. If you want to be liberal, you gotta join the West, right? Like, and even with the trade, like, what are the potential effects of, some global trade realignment that reduces the U.S. dominance, right? And how could such changes promote a more equitable and sustainable global economy, right? And even if, Brother Turaabi has, some principles of how this shift can align more with economic principles, and challenge essentially this Western narrative, right, that is being promoted.
Well, I would say, first of all, just as a general principle, the best way and really the only way, except for some sort of divine intervention, the only way that you can change misbehavior is through accountability. There has to be accountability. And if Article 6, first of all, economic sanctions against the United States are unthinkable as long as America remains in the United Nations, because obviously they would just veto any such measure. So once America is expelled from the United Nations, as it well should be, then they would the next logical step would be that the violations for which they are expelled they would be held accountable for those violations, and the most likely mechanism for accountability would be economic sanctions. Now, America operates on a trade deficit every year of at least $1 trillion, meaning that they import $1 trillion more than they export worth of goods and services. So those would be goods and services that would no longer be available to the United States. Not to mention, of course, that economic sanctions would include the purchase of exports from the United States. So roughly a quarter of the American GDP is based on international trade. So this would be a devastating blow to the American economy. And when we say the American economy, what we mean is the owners and controllers of global financialized capital who are based in the United States. It means the elites. It means the corporations that are controlling your lives and every aspect of your lives. It means the oppressor class would be impacted by economic sanctions, and this would potentially decrease, or rather, I won't even say potentially. I would say predictably, this would decrease the power of those corporations in terms of their control over the government, over their ability to buy off the government. So the accountability that America would, because, another aspect of this is that these corporations have tremendously benefited specifically from America's domination of the UN, which has enabled them to have tremendous power internationally, which they wouldn't have otherwise, not to the extent that they do. So if they were deprived of this instrument for the globalization of American policy, this would by itself would also tremendously limit and reduce the power and the leverage of corporations in America. And then again, as I say, this would also decrease their ability as their profits dry up. It would decrease their ability to dominate the American government. So you could potentially have a situation where the government actually becomes more responsive to the population than it is now. So I think that that the impact of sanctions would, to a certain extent, would be difficult for the population, but it would be much more difficult for the elites of the society. And if America were to be sanctioned by its major trading partners, I think that the American economy would never be the same. The value of the dollar would plummet, the stock market would plummet, and inflation would skyrocket. And yes, this would be difficult for the population to a certain extent, but again, it would also open up to the population the option of redressing their grievances to international bodies that are charged with the enforcement of international law, which is not something that they have now. And I think that would make a tremendous difference for American citizens, and the excuse me, the accountability that would be imposed upon the American economy would also make a huge difference in terms of the domestic power dynamic.
I'd like to take a bit of a different angle. Jazakallahu khairan, may Allah reward you, Brother Shaheed. You know, as you astutely pointed out, the so-called sanctions levied by the United States on these other nations have caused their economies to grow. But if it was the inverse, it definitely would not work like that. It would not work that way at all. I think sometimes, and I'm speaking more to our Muslim audience, and maybe this will also serve to be insightful for our non-Muslim brothers and sisters in humanity who are listening in. But sometimes the notion of boycott, divestment, and sanctioning, or even like the concept of corporate democratization or economic sovereignty, seems to be a subject that is maybe subconsciously, maybe due to the psychosocial conditioning, or just because of ignorance, or some combination of all three, or even more components than that, that there is no call for this in the Quran. There is no call for this in the biography of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There is no example or precedence for this in our illustrious 1,446 year history. But there's actually a very specific example of this in the Quran. And I've always kind of found it to be rather fascinating. I'll try not to ramble or meander at all, but the defense of the economic policies that we see within the United States, I'll first and foremost mention the way that they defend their economic policies and the global ramifications is by conflating issues. You know, if you say this about these people, then you're anti-Semitic. If you go about it this way, then you're unpatriotic. If you this, that, and the third. So it's just this constant conflation of issues. And this playbook is a timeless playbook by oppressors who have economic power over the oppressed. This is a consistent and timeless playbook by people in power over the community, the society, the world that they have that power over, because they understand on some level that sanctions attack the one thing that make these people in power actually care enough to change things, and that is their money. And the truth is, we have an incredible example of how this type of economic sanctioning on a divine level changed the mind of one of the worst oppressors in all of human history, Pharaoh. Now, some of you may be hearing this and you're like, what are you talking about? Where do you find that? It's actually found in Surah Yunus, chapter 10, verse number 88. Now, the scholars, the Mufassirin, the Quranic, the explainers of the Quran, they explain that Moses, he tried to call Pharaoh to release the children of Israel from their 400 plus year slavery for over 40 years. And it kind of hit a wall where the oppression of Pharaoh, in the face of all the signs that God was giving, even in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, you know, these series of signs, and it's also alluded to in the Quran as well, in Surah Al-Araf, the 7th chapter, Surah Naziat, the 78th chapter, 79th chapter of the Quran, that there were all these signs to get Pharaoh to stop. But then Musa and Harun, Moses and Aaron, they made a very specific dua. They made a very specific supplication. And I want you to just listen to this. They said, and someone correct me if I say it wrong. And it's in, I believe, and just double check me, please, in Surah Yunus chapter 10, verse 88. رَبَّنَا طَمِسْ عَلَىٰ أَمْوَالِهِمْ. They raised their hands and they prayed to God Almighty, "Oh Allah, obliterate their wealth." Completely get rid of their wealth. And so the scholars of history, they say that when Moses and Aaron made this dua, when they made this prayer, God Almighty turned their crops into stones. Their crops were their economy. And when their crops turned to stone, Pharaoh, he pulled a timeless tactic. The same man who in Surah Ghafir, the 40th chapter, verse number 25, the same man who literally committed infanticide and would abuse the women and enslave the men. In the following verse, verse number 26, he said, "I'm afraid that Moses is going to change your religion and he's going to spread fasad in the land." What caused him to finally break in to say, "Oh, Moses is a problem. He's spreading corruption on the face of the planet"? It's when their economy started to get hit. That same anti-Semitism, that same unpatriotic, that same playbook of demonizing the people is the same playbook that they inevitably that they run on us to this day. And when that playbook is run, because people don't know how to necessarily really pick it apart and show just how wrong it is, what gets happened is we get called un-American, in some arenas even called terrorists. We get called all of these different names and labels. But Moses and Aaron raising their hands against the economy of Pharaoh, that didn't make them racist against Egyptians. And when that happened to their economy, everybody felt that discomfort. The Egyptian elite felt that discomfort. The Egyptian so-called citizens felt that discomfort. And the Hebrews felt that discomfort too. But they understood that hit that impacted everyone was for a greater cause. So that temporary discomfort was just a symptom of trying to remove the keys to power that allowed for the oppression to exist in the first place. And I could really go on, maybe in a separate discussion on the fiqh of boycott, divestment, and sanctioning from the seerah, from the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Could be a way to unpack that a bit more. But to conclude, to summarize, we have to understand that if we don't take the measures within our means of really the understanding, and Sheikh Shahid has pointed this out many times, that the consumer has the power over the corporation. How active we are in seizing that power, or how inactive we are in seizing that power, plays a major role in the power dynamics that remain in play. If we can start within our own spheres of influence by seizing that power in obviously legal, but understandably necessary ways, yes, there may be discomfort. And yes, there may be, some of the things, the luxuries that we experience, that, the price of gas might go up, the price of milk might go up, we might have to we might actually have to come together and support each other and not be so independent. We may have to endure, somehow, some way, becoming a collective in the face of those difficulties. But the impact and the change that we will see as a result of it, if the economic hit that Fir'aun experienced caused him to free the children of Israel, then imagine if as a community, as a society, globally, nationally, beyond, if we can come together and begin to move the needle in that way, how much change can happen when we finally see an impact on the arena that is really the God of these people, which is money. So my apologies if that was a bit too verbose, but I hope that it was well heard.
It was beautiful, mashallah. And, it's exactly like Brother Shahid, compares it to this Pharaoh's palace again, right? And you, compared it, you took it a step further, mashallah. So I really think that everything that needed to be said today and understood has been, inshallah, understood. I would just like to reiterate, or sorry, Ustaz Shahid, you want to?
No, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add that when we're talking about economic sanctions being imposed upon the U.S., it's for violations of international law, domestically and abroad. So there's a remedy for the removal of sanctions, which is compliance with international law at home and abroad. So how is that not a good thing for the American people themselves, not to mention obviously for the rest of the world? But I mean, Sister Imane was talking about the multiple violations that America commits against their own people. Well, the sanctions would require them to remedy that. It would require them to rehabilitate their relationship with their own citizenry. Not to mention, as I said, their relationship with the rest of the world, with the rest of the populations of the world. That they wouldn't be able to dominate and oppress and suppress people the way they do now, both within the United States and abroad. Well, that's obviously a good thing. There's not a way to make the situation better except by means of this. As I said, there's not a way to rehabilitate the behavior of your government except through accountability. There's no way to do it. And that and it's not just the government. We're talking also about the power of the private sector. There's not a way to rehabilitate their behavior towards you and towards the rest of the people of the world except through accountability. So it's not that sanctions would simply be a punitive measure that's causing people to suffer. The whole point of it is to try to get your power structure to actually comply with international law and respect the rights of people in the United States and around the world. That's only a good thing for everyone.
MashaAllah, brother. Exactly. It's, we're trying to, genuinely protect, right, the citizens' rights and their dignity, right, and all of the citizens. This is the whole point of all of it. Alhamdulillah, I think it was a wonderful session today. I learned so much from our brothers, so thank you very much, Ustaz Shahid and Brother Turaabi. You are inspiration to all of us, I believe. Thank you all very much, and hope to see you, inshallah, next week again. Jazakumullah khairan, and have a blessed rest of the weekend, inshallah.
Barakallahu feekum, everyone. Thank you so much. Yalla, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.